I'm pleased to have a special guest here to introduce our next speaker. Alexander McCoven is the CEO of Conscious Capitalism, an organization that supports a community of business leaders dedicated to elevating humanity through business. And so without further ado, we'll jump right into it. So please give a warm welcome and widen our circle of compassion for Alexander McCoven, CEO of Conscious Capitalism.
Graham, thank you so much for this opportunity. And Jay and everyone on your team, thank you for putting this amazing conference together. It really is an honor to be speaking to all of you, and especially to introduce someone who has been an incredible mentor, friend, and leader, not just for Conscious Capitalism, but for so many movements and business leaders across the globe. I will read off a little bit of his bio so you have an understanding of just how accomplished Rand is, because he is the managing director of the Stagen Leadership Academy, established in '99, training leaders from across North America who are committed to long-term personal development and using their organizational platforms for positive impact. And prior to Stagen, he was president of the Presidio Media Group, publisher of newspapers and magazines in the Southwest, former chapter president of Young Entrepreneurs Organization. He's the past chairman and is still a member of the board of directors of Conscious Capitalism. And overall is just an amazing conscious leader and individual. But what I really want to emphasize is that of all the incredible leaders that I get to work with and that I've met over the years, Rand really does bring this concept of conscious leadership to life in a way that very few do. As he likes to describe it, being able to find simplicity on the other side of complexity, being able to understand who people really are at that human level, and helping leaders develop their own consciousness in a way that really is unparalleled. That's why he really is, in my opinion, the godfather of the conscious capitalism movement, the person that everyone turns to when they have a question or they need something, and who has guided so much of our movement and other business leaders for so long. It's a pleasure to get to know him, work with him, and call him a friend. And it's a pleasure to introduce him to all of you today. Rand, the floor is yours, and everyone, enjoy the wisdom of Uncle Rand.
All right, Alexander, you were too kind, and I want to thank you for that wonderful introduction, and most importantly, thank Graham and Jay and the Do More Good team for the opportunity to come back, almost bringing the band back together. Preeta, Jay Cohen Gilbert, who's coming after me, we were all together on the physical stage in Lincoln 2 years ago, and it's great to be back virtually. So I have a set of slides like Kate did, and welcome Kate to the conversation. I look forward to being on the panel in a little bit later this morning. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And okay, so as Alexander said, I have had the opportunity to be a part of the Conscious global nonprofit since its beginning back in 2008. We are a global organization, and like Kate, for those of you that are not familiar with us, I'm going to give you just a very quick overview of the organization, a little bit of our philosophy, and then I'm going to, as Alexander alluded to, I'm going to really double click into one of the dimensions that's a key pillar for us, which is the leadership aspect of conscious capitalism. So to start, go ahead and share the purpose, which Graham also mentioned in his setup. Our purpose is to elevate humanity through business. So this idea of consciousness and the idea of the elevated nature of moving up. Preeta talked about the horizontal domain versus the vertical domain. Some of you may know that as sort of the kairos of a Greek way of looking at this, and the chronos, or chronological. So we're going to really explore this verticality, the depth of what's possible when one combines consciousness, really deep intentional consciousness, with the form of capitalism that I'm going to speak to, that's been evolving and iterating for hundreds of years. So our credo, which is on our website, I'm going to go ahead and read this to you. This is foundational to us at an ideological level. We believe that business is good because it creates value. It is ethical because it is based on voluntary exchange. It is noble because it can elevate our existence. And it is heroic because it lifts people out of poverty and creates prosperity. Free enterprise capitalism is the most powerful system for social cooperation and human progress ever conceived. It is one of the most compelling ideas we humans have ever had. But we can aspire to even more. And I want to emphasize this last sentence with capitals to really pause. There is, and you're going to hear me talk about this later, there is incredible light in capitalism, and where there is light, there is shadow. And there are shadows in capitalism that have become, in many ways, intractable adaptive problems. And this idea here at the bottom of the evolutionary and progressive nature of any system, and we are going to talk not just in my presentation, but especially Jay Cohen Gilbert, who's coming up right after me, is going to talk about what we need to do to continue evolving and transforming the system of capitalism. And so I'm going to invite all of us for really the rest of the morning and maybe even the whole conference to be holding this dynamic tension between celebrating the healthy expressions of capitalism and recognizing that we need to move beyond the limitations of our current system and we need to stimulate progress going forward. So that polarity between preserving sort of the core positive attributes while simultaneously willing to lean into stimulating progress. And so the pillars, kind of philosophical model, just real quick, we believe that that organizations that are conscious businesses operate with a higher purpose beyond making money. We believe that that purpose expresses itself to create value in an interdependent way with stakeholders, of which shareholders are one of the stakeholders, but this is stakeholder management sort of 101. We believe that to be a conscious capitalism business, those human beings leading the business need to be operating from the principles of conscious leadership, and that from conscious leadership flows a conscious culture within an organizational level. So a lot of people will say to Alexander, to myself, or Raj Sasodi, or Kip Tindall, or John Mackey, who are really, from my perspective, the greats in our movement, and they'll say, how does one create, if conscious capitalism is really about conscious businesses, like how do we create more conscious businesses in the world, businesses that are purpose-driven and stakeholder-oriented? And I would invite all of us to go sort of upstream, because upstream of every conscious business is going to be a conscious culture. And then we would say, well, if you have to have a conscious culture to have a conscious business or a conscious company, then what's upstream? What's the root cause of a conscious culture? And that would ultimately be the leader or the leaders. The consciousness of the leader and the consciousness of the top leadership team in any organization is going to create a culture, an ethos. It's going to be flowing from those senior leaders down into the organization and ultimately out into the business. And then people will say to us, well, if the real key here to building a conscious capitalism enterprise is the leader, well, what's the unlocking move? How do we actually bring more conscious leaders into the world? And the answer to this, as we like to say, and you'll hear this a lot in our movement, is that conscious leadership is an inside job. I want to say this again. Conscious leadership is an inside job. Leaders cannot outsource this work. They cannot hire consultants to do this for them. They cannot delegate this to their head of HR or their head of people. If you are a senior leader, if you're a CEO, this is your work to do. And what I want to share with you is beyond just the conscious capitalism frame is our experience at the Stagen Leadership Academy, which for the last, over 20 years, for the last 22 years, we've been working with thousands of leaders who have been coming to our organization and working with our faculty and asking them and asking our team this question: what do I need to do to become a more conscious leader? Let's be practical here, that this really isn't a destination. This is a commitment to a lifelong journey of waking up, becoming even more conscious. And so what I'm going to do is now pivot from conscious capitalism, the organization, and give you some insight into what we're learning at our Leadership Academy about developing the capacity to become a more conscious leader. And this is very subtle, because people say, so Rand, so Alexander, you're saying that I can just become a conscious leader if I understand these principles. And that would be like saying, well, could I lose 50 pounds if I just understand the principles of exercise and eating well? And a trainer would say, well, of course not. The principles are the roadmap, but you've got to do the work. You've got to actually have the commitment to doing this journey of getting physically fit. Or if one of you, let's go back to Brian Moore, great exercise this morning, Brian, with music. Well, I want to learn how to play the guitar. Well, sure, there's some frameworks that Brian could talk with you about, but you ultimately need to be able to build that musical capacity by practicing. And so the word in the upper right of this screen, capacity, is really the spine of the rest of my presentation. And so I've given you a simple framework here, from a conventional leader level to a conscious leader level. And I'm going to give you three dimensions of conscious leadership. The first dimension is the move from a shareholder orientation to a stakeholder orientation. And so I want to hold that move in the context of a sphere of concern. And I'm going to unpack these for you after I clear the overview. But this first one is, and as you're listening, what is your sphere of concern? The beautiful Einstein quote was the great setup for me, Graham, on how do we realize that there's this tendency to contract into a smaller circle of concern, a sphere of concern, and how do we see the role of an expanded circle as a capacity of conscious leadership. Then we're going to talk about time horizon, from a conventional leader consciousness, a conventional leader level, which would be more short term, to a more expanded consciousness that's long term. And then finally, we're going to talk about perspective. At our Leadership Academy, we have a team of psychologists and psychotherapists and researchers around human development. We even have a religious scholar on staff full time at our facility. And we've been studying the work of great researchers like Robert Keegan, Bob Keegan at Harvard, who we've had the opportunity to also work directly with, and Ken Wilber, just wonderful philosophers that some of you may know those names. And one of the things that's always surprising when we talk to corporate leaders is the way they respond when we say that perspective and the capacity to hold and take more perspective is actually a developmental progression. That you can't just decide, I want to be able to see things with more dimensionality, that greater dimensionality of perspective taking comes online as a capacity, like a musical capacity or like a strengthening capacity of the body. And we're going to talk about the move from common ground to higher ground. And this is probably what I'm most excited to share with you today is this last section. So let's do a relatively quick overview. The first two are a little bit more concrete. The last one is much more subtle, of the move from a shareholder orientation to a stakeholder orientation. And we love this quote. Tell me what you care about, and I will tell you how big you are. And so when we're working with high-powered, especially CEOs, we really challenge them and even provoke them and say, how big are you playing in your life? And can you play even bigger? And when I listen to Kate talk about 1% for the planet, what I feel in her presentation and in her members is a group of leaders who are willing to play even bigger in their life. And this graphic here may be a very helpful illustration to really unpack this. When you think about a sphere of concern, and you think about it as a small circle where I, as an individual, stand, that's just me. Psychologically, this is sometimes called egocentric. When we move to expand our sphere of concern from just me to us, I'm now moving to people close to me. And if I'm a business leader and it's just about me and the shareholders, then that's us. Yeah, it's me, the executive, maybe my incentive plans for my top execs, and then the shareholders themselves. So that's an us. And I think Jay is going to talk about incentives and the problem that we find ourselves in with how things are incentivized for leaders that are in control of organizations today. The ultimate move that we want to challenge all of you into, and to challenge ourselves into every time we review this, is this move to a all of us sphere of concern. So now it's no longer just me and the board and the shareholders. Now it's me, the board, the shareholders, the customers, the employees, the environment, a silent stakeholder, all of the stakeholders, both directly and indirectly in the marketplace. So that's one big move we want you to consider making, is what's your sphere of concern as a leader. The next one is the move between short-term and long-term. And in short-term or long-term, you're going to see a definition on our website at stagen.com. We basically say a short-termer is a leader who evaluates success in the context of quarters or a year. And this is a person who is habitually driven by a pathological urgency, especially the pathology of short-termism in our public markets today. We introduced a term several years ago called a decader, to be a decader. And our members of our Leadership Academy really resonate with this idea of evaluating success in the context of decades or even lifetimes. And these leaders feel also motivated, but it's a conscious motivation by an existential urgency. Someone who's motivated to save the oceans feels an urgency. It's an existential urgency, a quality of urgency that's very different than the pathological urgency. And so this model, I'm not going to try to unpack, but I want to make one big idea. I'm going to give you just a big theme. There is a lot of research on adult development. And what you're going to see, I mentioned conventional leaders, is that most leaders in America and in Europe, approximately 85% by a number of data sets, are operating at a conventional level. And that conventional level of leadership is operating off of a time horizon that's 3 to 5 years. Jim Collins studied a level of leadership that he called good to great. So we've lined up, level 5 leadership in the book, Good to Great. And so these level 5 leaders had a very different, distinct way of leading. And this is about 10% of corporate leaders. And this is a 10+ year operating horizon. These are decaders. And then finally, the leading edge of what's emerging at the highly conscious leaders would be less than 6%. And these time horizons operate in my own lifetime, multi-generational, and eternity, which is Preeta and I really connected on at the last conference, of this idea of a timeless time. And what I want to put across is the big idea, because this can be a little overwhelming. So just zoom out. And here's the big idea. The capacity to operate with a longer term time horizon is a capacity, not simply an attitude. We can't just go to the public markets and say to leaders who are at conventional level of development and say, you need to operate with a longer term time horizon, because the capacity to operate with a long-term time horizon has to come online through development, not just through scolding or through some kind of a new governance structure. It's got to be a capacity. And in my last few minutes, I want to clear the distinction between common ground and higher ground. I'm going to do this relatively quickly. And I've got a constitutional lawyer, Preeta, in the room. So I wanted to give an example of the distinction, and I'm going to toggle back to the hallmarks between common ground and higher ground. Because what we say is, when there's conflict, which we're seeing a lot of conflict in the United States right now, there's a lot of hyperpolarization in our culture. What we see people aspire for is, well, there's these factions that are fighting. Can't we just find common ground? And one of the problems or limitations that we have with common ground is, then you have 2 or 3 groups that are coming together, and they're all being told to make some kind of a trade-off, to give some kind of a compromise. And so everybody gives something up, and what's left is a diluted version of what was there before. And higher ground is actually when we create something. What emerges is actually something that never existed in the past or never existed prior. And so this is really the last slide for the big idea here. And so I want you to imagine that there's these three branches of government. And through history, obviously, versions of the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch have existed through time. The Greeks, the Romans, even Genghis Khan would be a version of an unhealthy version of the executive, of a strong, dominant leader. Where in the judicial, we could go back to the Native American Indians and some of the early judicial processes they had, and obviously lots of versions through time on different versions of the legislative branch. So when people will say to us, what do you mean higher ground? Higher ground seems almost utopian, almost idealistic. And what we're saying is when you have three, in this case, three branches, and those, or let's just say three stakeholders, or let's just say three factions, or even three individuals, and you bring those together at a higher level, what emerges at the higher ground is actually something that never existed before. It is new, it is generative. It takes the best of what's at the lower level, and it brings the best of those together to create something that is brand new. And so what we want to challenge you to think about, and I'm going to go ahead and black out my screen here. What we want to challenge you to think about as I end here is when you look at what's going on in the world today and the conflict and the polarization, and you're operating from a level of a conscious leader, where you're operating with this aspiration of higher ground, instead of looking at the other, as my friend Jamie Wheel likes to say, othering the other, and only seeing the pathology of the other. What if we could actually see the positive, the light of the other or others? And what if we could work together from a consciousness standpoint to be able to create something that never existed in the past, to create something that's new? And that is what we're going to stand for. And I look forward to talking a little bit more in the panel, but my time is up. And so I'm going to hand it back to Graham to continue with the show. And thank you so much, Graham.
Thank you, Rand.
And Rand, I just want to jump in and just mention to folks here real quick that I could listen to Rand talk all day, and that's the thing about today's event. With what we're doing with this entire segment, I could say the same about Kate and Frida and our next speaker, J. Cohen Gilbert. The notion of thinking and acting long term is something that has really transformed the way that I have been processing the world in the last couple of years, and I've repeated your phrase about conscious leadership being an inside job probably more times than I care to admit. Even my kids hate hearing me say that to them now. But I do want to just let everybody know that the integral leadership program that Rand puts on for his students in his academy, it's a 52-week practice-based program that is designed to develop executives in companies or individuals about transforming their leadership skills, their teams, their organizations. I encourage everybody to take a look at that. There's some really amazing things happening there, and I am a proud student of Rand's Leadership Academy, I can say.